Hey TCSTV viewers, it's Evelyn coming to you live from the camera store today with the TCSTV Dream Team. I have Drew and Aaron working behind the scenes with me today. Thank you so much for tuning in this morning in Calgary for Natural Art Landscape Photography with Dave Brosha. This is sponsored by Sigma Canada, and this is a very special TCSTV live event because we are celebrating today. It is our 25th anniversary of the camera store being in business, and we're doing a bunch of live streams throughout the entire weekend. And so if you want to check more of these out, make sure that you're subscribed, hit that notification bell, and of course you can always head over to thecamerastore.com under the events tab to check out all the details. And on that note, if you registered for this event, you are also going to get some exclusive Sigma Canada offers. And these are going to be sent to you. We can't post them online. I can't even talk about them here, but we will email them to you along with a survey about the event because we love hearing your feedback. And so make sure you watch out for that. And if you didn't register and you want to get in on it, you can also send me an email to evelyn@thecamerastore.com and I'll make sure we add you to the list. But the best part about these live stream events, of course, is we can interact with you. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can always join the YouTube chat and talk with us there. We'll answer questions towards the end in the Q&A. Or if you're not logged into YouTube and you want to participate, you can send me an email to evelyn@thecamerastore.com as well, and I'll make sure that we get your questions answered during the Q&A. But lastly, before I introduce our guests, I did want to do another shout out to Sigma Canada, and we are fortunate enough to have Danny Lee from Sigma to help answer questions during the Q&A. So if you have any technical questions about lenses, then he'll be here to help as well. And so if you don't know our guest, Dave Brosha is passionate across a wide spectrum of photographic genres. He is a published photographer with his books behind me, and we're going to be offering 20% off all of our books for the 25th anniversary sale, including his book, Northern Light. We'll put the link to that in the chat. And he's also a Sigma Pro photographer and the co-founder of the Offbeat Photographic Community. And he offers a wide range of workshops, seminars, all across the world and Canada. And he's based in the East Coast of Canada, but right now he's actually on the road. And so I want to welcome both Dave and Danny. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Yeah, so you're on the road right now, hey Dave?
Yeah, I'm broadcasting live from this very fancy hotel room in Regina, Saskatchewan. So happy to be here and just so honored to be part of this great event with you guys today.
Fantastic. And we have people from all over the world joining us in the chat, including, I noticed, a few people from Saskatchewan. So welcome, guys. Shout out to you, and thanks for joining us on this Saturday morning. And before, I guess, we get into anything else, I just want to say thanks again, Danny, for making all of this happen. We've worked with Dave before when he was able to come to Calgary, and it's just so great to be able to connect again virtually. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for hosting. Congratulations to the Camera Store on their 25th anniversary. And I look forward to Dave Brosha's presentation. He's awesome images, awesome presenter, and thank you so much.
Fantastic. Well, Dave, why don't you go ahead? You can get right into it.
All right, thanks so much. And just, big thanks to you, Danny, and to Evelyn and all the folks at the Camera Store. I'll just give you guys a quick little plug because I'm not just saying this because you're inviting me to speak today. I live in PEI and I order from you guys all the time. You're my go-to Camera Store, and I just really appreciate all that you do for the photographic community. So today, maybe I'll just load up my presentation here and we'll hop right into it. Just give me one quick second here, folks. All right, here we go. So today I'm going to be talking about something that I like to refer to as natural art. And this is kind of a shortened version of a much longer 4-hour talk I give. But what is the heart of this presentation today? It's really about the idea of how we as photographers can make more compelling images, right? We spend a lot of time in this pursuit of photography. We spend a lot of money on great gear, and we like to go out and take photographs that make us happy, of course. And over the course of my career, I've taken a lot of pictures that I like and a lot of pictures that I consider pretty, and a lot of things that I have shared with different people over the over the many years doing this. But I find one of the things that's toughest in photography is taking a really compelling image, a really memorable image. So that's kind of where I want to focus my attention today. I know you have lots of great speakers over this week, and Evelyn, and people could be talking on a wide range of subjects, but I'm going to kind of focus my attention there. So what is natural art? Well, before I get into that, just a very quick background for anyone who doesn't know me, which is, I'm guessing most of you. My name is Dave. I live in Prince Edward Island, as Evelyn mentioned, and I have 3 beautiful children. And I have been a photographer now for about 20 years. It was about 20 years ago that I first kind of picked up that camera, and I had the passion, and I had no intention of being a photographer. I didn't know that this was my calling and what I wanted to do in life, but my journey starts, I think, the same way that so many people watching here today started, right? We pick up this little piece of technology and we go out and we point it at the world, and something gets rendered back to us that makes us excited and happy and makes us want to do it again. And it was just through those initial presses of the shutter, those initial explorations in the world around me, where I realized just how much I loved doing that, right? And I never really considered myself an artistic person before I picked up a camera, right? And in many ways, I kind of was trying to figure out what I wanted out of this life. What did I want to do? And when I found photography, I realized that, hey, there was an answer to that I had something that made me excited, that made me want to pursue it a bit more. My background in photography started as a landscape nature photographer. I was very fortunate enough to be born in the north, actually in northern Alberta. I live in Prince Edward Island now, but I was born in Fort Vermilion, Alberta, and grew up my first 15 years there. And then eventually ended up back in Nunavut for a couple years and in the Northwest Territories. And it was really in Nunavut and Northwest Territories where I got my start as a photographer. And it's hard not to be intrigued by photography when you live up there. You really have a sense living in those magical places that you live in a different environment from most people. Most Canadians, even though we all consider ourselves northerners to some extent compared to the rest of the world, it's a dramatically different landscape once you kind of cross that 60th parallel. And so these were here's 3 examples of my earliest playgrounds in photography, right? Being able to explore the wide open tundra in the subarctic and the Arctic, the incredible displays of aurora borealis that you'd find in when I lived in Yellowknife, just home to some of the most incredible skies in the whole world, really. And then on the very left there, Nunavut. And Nunavut is really a place that is about the beauty of nothingness, right? It is one of the most sparsely populated places in the world. It is one of the most wide open. There's no trees. There's just endless land. But within that nothingness is a beauty that spoke to me like I can't even begin to describe. And I realized in my earliest explorations out there, either by foot or by snowmobile, that this planet is so incredibly worth protecting and documenting. And I think that was some of my earliest things that I wanted to do in photography, was just show that world with other people so that they might care as well. I also do portraits. Now, today I'm not going to really talk about portraits, but it is a big part of who I am. And I just bring this up to kind of maybe refer to the fact that we as photographers have a power to be able to photograph people and place, the world around us. And it's got so much incredible beauty. And I'm going to kind of cycle back to this towards the end, but I just would encourage everyone to really look at all the world around them. Whether you're a landscape photographer, look at the people. If you're a people photographer, look at the landscape, because there's so much incredible beauty to document. As Evelyn mentioned, I have a company called Offbeat. That's what I do kind of in my 9-to-5 world for the most part these days. It's a photographic community and kind of a photography education workshop company as well. But before So before I get into the heart of my presentation today, and before I kind of get into what I think makes a compelling image, and I'm going to analyze a bunch of different images through that, including some of my favorite images from other people. Just to introduce you to who I am, what I love to shoot. I'm going to have a quick, I think it's about 3.5 minute slideshow here that the Camera Store folks will be good enough to queue up, and then we will get right back into the talk. Thank you.
I heard a rumor I could find you at the new frontier. I kept fixing my hair, checking my lips in the mirror. A two-step, back step, turn around and dip your head back, cowboy. Shake those lazy hips in my direction. Eternal connection. Sweetie, won't you dance all night? Oh, Charlie, it's just you and I. And with your hand on my back, I feel your cold, dark side. And now you've acted strange since those 12 men drowned. Yet I forget all about it when you dance around. And they told me if I whistled you would dance all night, all night. And so I stayed up till the morning light, morning light. Yeah, they told me if I whistled you would dance all night, all night. And so I stayed up till the morning light. We all knew that you were staying over in those caves, because after you left, we found your raven's grave. And when you drank our water, it got in your soul. You can run and hide, but you can't shake the hold as time flies by. Well, time can run you back too. Ooh, Charlie, look up in the sky. You're such a beautiful sight for a cold, dark night. And we've looked at you strange since those 12 men drowned. Yet there's still love in our eyes when you dance around. And they told us if we whistled you would dance all night, all night. And so I stayed up till the morning light, morning light. Yeah, they told us if we whistled you would dance all night, all night. And so we all stayed up till the morning light. Oh, Charlie, baby, sweetie, won't you dance all night?
All right, welcome back, everyone. So hopefully you enjoyed that slideshow, and just wanted to give a very quick just shout out to the singer of the beautiful song that accompanied that, who's given me permission to use it. That song was done by Dana Manning out of Ontario, and she's just a beautiful singer-songwriter who's been in the Canadian music scene for many, many years. And that song is called Charlie Lake. So if you feel like supporting her, that would be great as well. So let's move on. So I said at the start, the heart of my talk today is going to be about this. What makes a compelling photograph? Now, it's strangely really hard I find to achieve a level of a compelling photograph. Through the course of my career, I estimate that I've now shot probably about 1.9 million photographs. And in that, I've got a lot of photographs I like, right? We go out year after year and shoot lots of images, and you call them down and you kind of narrow them down and you have your favorites. And I've got thousands maybe in that favorites photo of things that I think are decent. But of that 1.9 million photographs, how many would I actually call compelling? I would probably estimate no more than 50 to 75 that for me really stand the test of time. But I want to talk about what that means, though, compelling. What is my kind of litmus test for what makes a compelling photograph? So first of all, this is, I think, to me, the most important mark of a compelling photograph, one that you remember, right? I think it's reasonably easy in today's photography world to take a pretty photograph, right? Like even our smartphones that we pick up, iPhones and Samsung and all that kind of stuff, you can go out there and they have powerful technology in them. They have powerful algorithms. The cameras are pretty decent. And I think it's reasonably easy to get to make a pretty photograph. Anyone with a little bit of photography knowledge and training and can learn their camera fairly quickly can go out there and shoot something pretty. And that has a way of interesting us for a while. I mean, it did for me for sure, right? I love going out and creating pretty photographs, and I still do. But I love the challenge of trying to create those really memorable pictures, right? The ones that, I mean, yes, you hope they connect with other people, but more importantly, I think when you're photographing them, they connect with you, that you feel like you've done something different or unique, or that is, just not the usual that everyone does. And I'll kind of give you an example. Right here is a very popular place in Europe. It's in the Faroe Islands. It's I'm probably going to mess up the pronunciation of the village, but Gassadalur, I think. And this right here is one of the most scenic sites in the Faroe Islands. And before I traveled to the Faroe Islands for the first time, I saw pictures from this spot, from this location, and I just knew I had to go there, right? It was just, look at it, right? The one of a kind, unique waterfall, the little village in behind, the dramatic cliffs, the green surrounding it. And the thing is, though, about this spot and this location is you don't really have a lot of choice in terms of where you position yourself. So as a result, the hundreds, if not thousands and 10,000 thousands of photographers that go to this location kind of all go to this little point and photograph across this little cove into the village and capture a photograph that is very similar to this. So this is a picture that I took that I consider pretty, right? Like I like this photograph. I'm proud that I took it. I think I was especially happy that I had the two little birds flying through right at the moment that I kind of snapped this. And by all means, I like this photograph. But if I really ask myself, does this stand the test of time? Is it a unique photograph? I would argue probably not, right? It's, if you plugged in this location into Google or searched on Instagram, you'd probably see 1,000 photographs, and they would all have slight nuances, but they would all look very much like this. Now, fast forward to kind of the day after this particular photograph was taken. I was there with my business partner and good friend, who I believe is actually speaking tonight for the Camera Store too, Paul Zizka. And we woke up the next day to just chaos. It was weather, it was fury, there was rain going sideways, a big storm system had moved in. And when we first woke up, we weren't even sure that we'd be able to go out and photograph that day. But as the day went on, or the morning went on, the weather kind of cleared out just a little bit, and there'd be little pockets where the rain wasn't going quite as wild. And we're like, oh, we have to go back. Let's just go back and see what this place looks like. And when we went back the next day to that location, our jaws dropped, right? It was incredibly moody. The waves were crashing halfway up those giant cliffs. The wind was so strong that little waterfall was flowing upwards. The wind was blowing it up and over the banks. And this to me was the moment that I live for as a photographer, right? On the edge of these crazy weather systems and just incredibly unique offerings. And this to me, this photograph here is one that I find compelling and memorable as opposed to this one here. Right. And it's not just because we had crazy weather and big waves, but it's because it's something different. Right. And this is one of the few photographs that I have hanging on my own wall in my own house. And it's just something that I'm very, very proud of, that we were willing, I guess, to push through the weather and just take a chance on what might be different. And I want to talk more about that as we go through the course of this presentation this morning. I'm going to give you another example. Here's a photograph I made probably about 5 years ago, placed close to a lot of you watching there in southern Alberta. This is Bow Lake in Banff. And this is a photograph that I took on a very beautiful morning, just pre-dawn, the sun's starting to rise there. And by all means, I like this photograph too. I was proud of this photograph. It represents a very beautiful moment that I experienced myself. I kind of walked into my image and sat down and just kind of took it all in. But when I look at this image too and critique it 5 years later with a little bit more experience, when I look at this image, I would say it's a beautiful moment, a beautiful memory. I'm very happy that I took it. I'm not mad that I took it. But I would argue that this is an image that would be very, very similar to many people's images out there, right? I won't go so far to call it a cliched image, but it's an image that is pretty, right? And that's what we take a lot of as photographers. But I love pushing beyond pretty, right? I love looking for just the deeper scenes, I guess, in nature that represent to me maybe just trying to get more artistic or trying to look beyond what others might see. And it's a very tough thing, right? Like I'm not always successful. Most times I'm not successful when I look for that stuff. But it is some of the happiest moments I have in photography when I feel like I've hit upon that. So let me give you another example from the Rockies. So this is kind of one image that I would say is a pretty image. The next image I find personally more compelling. Now, the next image I photographed at Abraham Lake, and it was one of those moments where, I mean, right now, I think it's kind of prime time at Abraham Lake for a lot of people in southern Alberta too, right? The higher lake levels and the water floods out some of the aspen trees and everything else. And that is a very beautiful kind of unique type thing to photograph. But what I really liked about this next morning is it really involved being in the right place at the right time, knowing where to go, taking the time to do the homework, and then being there right at the magic moment when light hits in a very particular spot. And this is kind of the image I was able to capture that particular morning. Had been there the day before, knew of this location, knew of these trees, and then that the light that you see there in the water, that only lasted, I think, 3, 4, 5 minutes tops. The sun had kind of hit that peak, it lit it up right in that angle, and then before we knew it, the light was gone and it moved on, right? So this to me is a picture in the mountains that doesn't involve mountains that is much more compelling to me than the picture before, where I think you wouldn't be able to tell that it's any different from anyone else's images. And I don't mean that to sound cynical, but I mean that hopefully as inspiration for us to push further. I want to give you 3 examples of people that inspire me and 3 people that I think make really compelling images consistently. There's a good chance you might even recognize all 3 of the names, and some of them I think the Camera Store have had speak as well there. But Victoria Hack out of BC, she does a fantastic arrangement of landscape and portraiture, wedding work, all kinds of stuff. And she does a lot of really wide angle, epic, beautiful landscapes. But one of the things that I find some of her most compelling is the way she sees the gentlest details in nature, as represented by that photo on the left. Paul Zizka, many people on this call would probably recognize that name. He's based in Banff, and he just has a passion and a drive to capture the world like almost no one I've ever seen. And Paul inspires many people in many ways. I think he's one of the greatest night photographers in the world. But one of the ways that he inspires me, and one of the things I find most compelling about his imagery, is as landscape photographers, we often think of landscape being a landscape perspective, right? The horizontal box. One thing I've noticed about Paul's work over the years, and I think it's very unique to him, is I would estimate that 80% of his portfolio is vertical, right? It's the way he sees the world. He sees the world in kind of a wide angle, vertical perspective. And it just makes his images incredibly compelling and uniquely his. Alan Schaller on the right, he's out of the UK. He does a genre of photography that I don't do, street photography. And I just find his use of light and shadow, using humanity mixed with human-made structures, just fascinating and incredibly compelling. One final person that I'll just quickly shout out here too in that realm is a good friend of mine, Curtis Jones, who lives up in the bounces between the Canadian Arctic and Newfoundland and Alberta. And just take this one image of his, which has always been one of my favorites. There's lots of things to appreciate about this outdoor image. And I use the term outdoor image because even as landscape photographers, I think sometimes we need to bust away from the notion that we only shoot nature, right? I love the fact that Curtis, who's primarily a nature photographer, still looks for moments like this. And in fact, I would say it's some of these type of photographs that are his most compelling. There's lots of compelling in this image, right? Even just the minimalistic nature of it, the dog looking to the right, you wonder why he's looking that way. But to me, the little detail, the beautiful detail that makes this photograph is the snow that you see kind of slanting across the back of the person sitting there. It's one of those really beautiful details. It takes you a moment to kind of notice, but once you notice, it gives you a sense of cold, of kind of desolate beauty. And I just really, really appreciate it. I find this an incredibly compelling image. So
Dave,
how do we go about? Yes.
Dave, I just wanted to mention, since you brought up Paul Zizka, he's actually going to be one of our other speakers tonight at 7 o'clock. And so if people want to see more of his work and hear from Paul, I just thought I would mention that they can check that out here tonight at 7 o'clock.
That's awesome, Evelyn. Yeah, and Paul is such a fantastic speaker. So if you haven't already heard him speak or you want to hear him speak again, highly, highly recommend it. He is so passionate. So thanks for that, Evelyn. So how do you go about trying to create more compelling imagery, right? It's a tough puzzle to figure out what are some of the pieces that go into that. Well, I'm going to just kind of quickly go through some of the things that I look for that help me in that process. And again, I don't want to pretend for a second like I make compelling images all the time. In fact, I take a lot of bad images, but I'm always on the hunt for those more compelling images. One of the things that I find really helps me in the field is by just even slowing down when I arrive on a location and doing what I call the visual inventory. Right. And this is just the notion of taking a few minutes, if time allows, and the conditions aren't just like once in a lifetime and you have to jump on them, taking the time to kind of just slow down and really consider your surroundings, right? What is here in the scene that could be potentially beautiful, right? Is it the line or the crack in the rock over there to the left? Is it the way the light might possibly burst through the trees and fog right over there? Is it the way the waves are lapping up to the shore? Is there a really symmetrical series of trees out there? I really like taking the time to kind of, I guess, analyze that stuff because it gives me ideas. And sometimes it helps prevent me from getting tunnel vision, right? Sometimes we walk to a place, especially some of the more iconic locations in the landscape world, and we beeline to maybe the picture that we've seen other people take, or just the major feature in a place. And you might miss all kinds of potentially even more beautiful things to photograph in a scene. And sometimes the most beautiful thing to photograph is the opposite of the iconic thing that you've gone out to photograph. So not only does it give me ideas, but it also gives me, I guess, just a comfort level of knowing what's there if conditions shift, right? Like, oh, okay, if the sunrise is there, I might want to be in this location. But if the sun happens to hit that peak over there, I got to remember that. I got to remember to turn around. That's part of my visual inventory. And I'll give you kind of a quick example just in terms of a place I love and so many people love, Tofino in British Columbia. So going to Tofino to shoot sunrise along this beach one morning, obviously the sunrise itself is going to be the star attraction, at least on the surface. But even as I'm kind of waiting for that sun to come up, like I said, I'm looking around, right? Look at the ripples in the sand. Look at that little tidal pool. That tidal pool might potentially be a great reflective surface if I get down low to it. What is happening behind me? Okay, I've got some cascading hills over to my left, different layers of trees. Birds are flying around. They're part of my visual inventory too. I might want to utilize them at some point. And so by even taking the time to kind of go through and really take stock of what's there, then when stuff happens, I can jump on them pretty quick, right? I can kind of go from one potential composition to another, or if something is really exciting me, just slowing down and taking the time to kind of work that one through to completion. But I love having these ideas. I love having kind of just that bank of potential, I guess, in quickly changing conditions. And so all these images were kind of photographed on that Tofino beach that day. And it all came out of kind of doing that visual inventory. Another, I think, very key part of the process that really helped me in my own evolution as a photographer is this notion of self-critique. Now, we hear that word critique sometimes, and I think we sometimes get scared by it, right? We think of critique as this formal thing where you go into a group, maybe a photography club, and you've got 15 other photographers present, and you put your image up on the screen, and somebody stands at the front of the room and basically tears your image apart. Well, the whole idea of a critique, though, is that notion of really examining an image and looking what is good and what could potentially be improved. And I really think a critique is both sides of that equation, right? You have to be able to recognize what's good or potentially good in an image to know what's bad. And I think sometimes we focus too much on the bad part, the improvement part of a critique. So how do you apply this in the field, right? I feel like in my first 10 years of photography, my process was very much one where I would just go and be like, okay, there's a pretty thing, snap. Then I'd walk a little further. Oh, that's pretty, click. And I don't think I would take enough time to really slow down and look at the image I just created and do a critique on it. And so one thing I found in my last 10 years in photography is this has become a big part of my process, right? Being able to stop, breathe, just look and think about the image I just photographed. What do I like about this? What, if anything, could potentially be improved? Because I think a lot of building strong images is kind of that art of one-upping yourself, right? Really looking and hitting upon something that you like and turning it into something you love. And I'm going to walk you through just a quick example. So here's a scene that I photographed in Iceland basically a month before the pandemic started. We were, or at least before the Canadian borders started really shutting down and lockdowns and all that kind of stuff. This was up the side of an ancient volcano, not even ancient. I think it was actually active back. Anyways, digression. Side of an old volcano. Bottom line is it wasn't spewing lava when I was walking up the side of it. The hope that night was to photograph the aurora borealis. And the forecast was calling for kind of clear skies later on. But by the time I got halfway up the side of this volcano, there was pretty decent cloud cover coming and going. And there was light pollution bouncing off these clouds from the nearby village that we were in. And at first, when I got up there, I'm like, oh, well, I hope we get northern lights tonight. All I could see is these clouds and light pollution. And I maybe took a minute or two of being bummed by that. But then I'm like, you know what? I'm out here. And I love challenging myself to make the most of any condition, no matter what that condition is. Like, okay, if I don't have the stars, if I don't have Milky Way, if I don't have Northern Lights right here in this moment, what am I going to do? How am I going to utilize this? And it's actually potentially interesting having that bounce light off the clouds. So let's start working this. So this is kind of shot number one, and this is just figuring things out, seeing how it renders in camera, and then I do a self-critique of that. Well, okay, well, the light is somewhat interesting, but I've got nothing there. I've got no story. I've got no real foreground. I've got no composition, no leading lines. You don't know what my subject is. Is it the foreground, kind of black lava type volcano feel, which you can't even really tell what I'm standing on because it is so dark? Or is my subject the clouds and the light and the stars? So I know I have to inject some sort of story or look for something different. Now, I kind of struggled up there that night finding a good foreground. There wasn't really dramatic rock features or anything that really stood out against the sky. So I decided to just go inject myself into the photograph. So this right here is, I think, much better than the image before, infinitely better than the image before, because at least now there is a subject. But I don't think this is a great photograph. And if I'm being very honest in critiquing this, and when I went back to my camera and took a look and critiqued it, there was a lot of things I didn't like about it. Now, first of all, what do I like? Well, I like that there's now the start of a subject. It's more dramatic. It's got the makings of perhaps a more epic image. I like the subtle movement in the clouds. I like how I stand out against the clouds. So those things I do like. What don't I like? Well, right now, to me, the foreground is still sort of pointless. Right? I'm not really utilizing it at all. It's wasted space. There's not an interesting line there. And in fact, it's a bit of a visual clutter, right? You have little bits of snow. You have little bits of stray light on the left-hand side of the foreground. Dirt there. I think that's a lighthouse kind of hitting from farther away. And really, just the composition-wise, with me dead center and all that kind of dead space down below, my pose is a little bit static, kind of look like I'm just standing there posing. So I knew I had to go back to the drawing board again. So make another attempt. This is getting a little bit better still. I've cut out some of the foreground, which I think improves just the overall feel of the composition. I can see more of the night sky. I can see the stars up over the clouds, right? It's moving along. Through that critique process, I'm getting it one step better. But what don't I like about this one? Well, now I don't stand out against the clouds. I've kind of hit a dark spot in the clouds rather than the brighter spot that I had prior. And still have a bit of a cliched, maybe pose, a bit of a hero pose there. And I like, when I use the human element in landscapes, I like it to feel a bit more natural, not so posed. So I knew I had to go back to the drawing board again. So I'm kind of near the top of the volcano on the ridge line right here. I decided to go take a walk a little bit further down the path that I just come up. Oh, here's just one more variation. But I kind of went down the path. And as soon as I went down and turned around and looked at this, I felt like I was onto something a little bit stronger, right? The path itself led to a bit of a leading line, a bit of a story there. And even just by going down two, all of a sudden now I get the silhouette of the nice ridge line that's kind of offset by the light pollution in the clouds. So this is, I think, a step up from what the area that I was working before, but I'm still ultimately missing a story here. I'm missing the thing that ties it all together. And I knew that perhaps if I went back up and put myself back in the photo, but even further away than last time, made myself smaller, made the image more wider so I can get up above the night clouds a little bit, then I might potentially have the image I was looking for. And ultimately, I did, right? This was kind of my final image from that sequence. And I was really happy with this. I felt like I went from a very static, maybe boring scene to something much more dynamic. And it's interesting what happens when you kind of work and push yourself like that. Later on that night, the Northern Lights did come out. We did get green in the sky. And I did take a number of photographs that I liked from that experience. But when I look back upon that night and I look back upon those images, this is the one that stands out to me as my favorite. It's the one that stands out to me as the most compelling of the bunch that evening. Right? I just felt like it was different. And it's utilizing something that a lot of night photographers shy away from, that I often shy away from, and that's light pollution. But here, it almost feels like lava coming out of that volcano, right? You wouldn't even really necessarily know that it's light pollution. But bottom line, I think I went from just a very average looking photograph to something much more compelling through the notion of pushing myself, self-critique, and looking for more compelling as I went along. Let's switch gears here. So the art of seeing. Seeing is something that doesn't come quickly. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of mistakes. It takes a lot of bad photographs. And it even takes a lot of pretty photographs before I think you can move on to really seeing and honing your vision on the world around you. And there's no right or wrong to seeing. Some people just have this ability to see through scenes very quickly on in their photographic journey. Other people takes longer. For me, I'll be quite honest, it took quite a while, I think, to develop my eye. If I look back upon my earliest images, I think so many of them were just static or flat or lacked a story or lacked anything really of interest. To me, a lot of the art of seeing comes down to this: looking for order in the chaos, right? The world is a big, busy, jumbled, beautiful mess of a place, right? And it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of downtown Regina or if you're in the middle of the forest. Forests, for example, are nothing but chaos, branches and leaves and everything going every which way. And they can be incredibly difficult to photograph, but we can see endless, incredible photographs from forests if the photographer has taken the time to do this, to look for the order in the chaos. And I really think that's what a lot of strong photography is. I think a lot of strong photography isn't so much about what to include, but rather the art of what to exclude from a scene, right? What is actually going to have impact? Let me give you another quick example. Here's a scene that I encountered last October in Alberta, driving from kind of Banff to Jasper. And I'd been hoping for kind of a snowy day for quite some time. I spent quite a lot of time in the Rockies, even though I live in PEI. And this particular day, just that beautiful, gentle snowfall started happening. And I don't know where exactly I am in the Rockies when I photographed this, but I loved kind of the scene. And this is kind of image number one that I took, or one of the first images that I took that particular afternoon. And so this image here, again, going back to that self-critique, what do I like? What don't I like? Well, I love the fact that there's layers of trees. I love the gentle softness of the snow falling. I can see that there's one tree in the foreground that's perhaps standing out against the background a bit more. But if I'm critiquing this, on the flip side, what can be improved? Well, I look at this, and I think the biggest problem with this photograph is I haven't chosen one of those elements as my subject. I've chosen all of them, right? I don't know what has the most weight. Is it the tree in the foreground? Is it the layers, or is it the snow? You can't really tell, right? So I felt like through that first analysis of my picture and doing that self-critique, I had to push further to find out what my story was. So here's kind of a second attempt. Now this one here, I'm trying to hone in on the trees a bit, the foreground trees, the things that might stand out. But I don't know if this is really a successful image either. It's a pretty image, and it's got a certain painterly feel to it. But again, my eye doesn't really know where to go. It's going to kind of all four of those foreground trees. The brighter green part of that bottom right corner maybe catches my eye, but I don't know if that helps the image. And it just, again, to me, it feels like I've got a pretty image, but not really a compelling image. I don't think anyone would really remember this image the next day, even after they saw it. So I wanted to push further. I wanted to look for order in the chaos. And so the image I ultimately settled upon that I ended up loving, which maybe happened 5 minutes after this particular image, was this image. Very simple, very minimalistic, really focused on that one foreground tree that I could find that stood out against the background trees. The snow picked up a little bit more then, and the background layers dissipated a bit, but I think that's okay, right? This just, to me, almost screamed like Christmas time, right? Like it just has that kind of a really, really soft winter vibe. And I made this into a print afterwards, and I ended up loving it, right? And I think it's a much stronger image than this particular image. And it comes out of seeking for that order in the chaos. Here's another take a little bit later as the snow started dissipating, right? Just very simple, very clean, but very orderly. One of my favorite things in photography nowadays, as I've evolved over 20 years, is looking for this, scenes within scenes, right? I think as a young photographer, and I think a lot of people might be guilty of this, we tend to think of landscape photography as wide angle photography. And by all means, that was the aesthetic that I was very much drawn to when I started out in my world of photography. Right, I'd go out with a wide angle lens on, look for the foreground, look for the epic background, try to tie them together. And I want to be very clear, I still love doing that stuff. And I still love wide angle photography. And I'll always love wide angle photography. But I think I get more joy nowadays looking for those little slices of beauty in a bigger scene. And let me show you some examples. And it's not to say that I don't take the end scene within a scene with a wide angle lens. Sometimes I very much do, but it's about honing in from the initial scene you see to the gold, the gem, the treasure within the scene. Going back to Abraham Lake last autumn, here's kind of the scene that I encountered, right? There's a high water level kind of going across the aspens, very, very beautiful conditions, very unique conditions. I'm a little bit late for prime autumn. There's some color in some of the trees, depending on your angle. But this was the first photograph I took. And when I looked at it on the back of my camera, same idea. Just like, this is too much chaos, too much clutter. Your eye doesn't really know where to go. You know there's good elements here, but how do I focus in on the story? What is the story? And if you look at these trees, if you look at the scene, I think at the bottom or the base of the middle aspens there's a really clean scene right around there, right? There's not all the tangled mess of branches up above. The way the water streaks and is moving, it's an incredibly windy day that day. I've shot this with long exposure, but down in that little section is a very clean scene. So I decided to shake it up a bit. This is too cluttered. So attempt number 2, I decided to go vertical, because at least I love how the lines down in the water, the reflection, carry up to those trees up above and then kind of push your attention maybe up to the mountains. So I think this is a big step up from the picture before. Now, overall, though, I like this one, but I didn't love it. I still think there's a bit too much chaos there. I don't quite have a clean representation. I don't have a clean scene. So I knew I had to work harder. And I think that's a lot of landscape photography, is pushing through and working harder, right? Realizing that you can find those beautiful images in almost every scene. You can walk down a road in a town or city and find all kinds of beauty. I think of the work of Richard Martin out of Ottawa, who just has this incredible way of seeing the world around him in everyday scenes. He sees colors and textures and contrasts. He doesn't need incredible mountainscapes to photograph really compelling photographs. Look him up if you don't know his name. So this right here, I knew I wanted to push further, work harder. This is getting there, right? It's a big step up from this. I've seen the scene within a scene. I've gone up to it. Even if it took work, I had to kind of wade out a little bit into the water. I had to flood my boots. I had cold feet, but I got to the location, the spot that gave me that cleanliness, that gave me that order. And this one I liked. This next one I loved. This was kind of my final shot of that sequence, where I felt, and this one is shot a little bit more wide than the one before. Right, I think this is still shot with a 70 to 200 millimeter Sigma art lens, farther back, zoomed in just a bit, but it's still a bit of a wider scene. And this one to me had just kind of that beautiful mixture of cleanliness along with some chaos, some nice contrast, the clean aspens with the beautiful remaining fall leaves in behind. But it took work. It took self-critique. It took pushing through. I'm going to just skip through this little section because I want to get to another thing while we still have time here. So going back to that notion, making your images stronger, I really love even using this terminology in my own brain when I'm out there photographing. Okay, Dave, you've got a good picture. Now challenge yourself to one up yourself. Right? Like what else can you do? What else can you look for to make this stronger? Right? Sometimes it involves patience or perseverance or just looking for things or anticipating things that might happen. Let me give you an example. This is a beautiful day down in Antarctica, and these humpback whales, 2 or 3 of them had come into this little bay, and everyone, of course, is really excited. I'm excited. Who doesn't love an encounter with a whale? They're one of the most beautiful creatures on this planet. And so when I first saw this scene and photograph this whale, I was really happy. And I looked at this image and was very excited about it. But then your brain starts going to the what if kind of scenarios. And I looked at this, I'm like, well, that's good. I'm really happy about this. But what if that whale gets closer to one of those icebergs? I'm safely far distance away. I have a really big lens on. I think I have the Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter lens here. And rather than kind of just letting it die and kind of walking away from the scene with one image that I'm really happy with, I'm like, you know what? Even if I'm here for the next half hour, these whales weren't going anywhere. And we were just kind of sitting there. I'm going to just wait and persevere and see what happens and hope that the whale goes a little bit closer to an iceberg. Not only did it go closer to the iceberg, it ended up doing tail flukes and everything else as it got closer to that iceberg. It just kept feeding, right? Pushing up krill. The whales down there do something called bubble net feeding, where they kind of push air up and it pushes krill, and then they feed on it. And so it became kind of predictable that every minute or two, the whale would emerge, kind of taking some krill and then dive back down, push up more air bubbles, push up more krill, and repeat. And so not only did I get the picture of the whale right next to the iceberg, he was joined by a friend, right? And just you started getting these magical moments where one would come up or the other one would come up. And if you were ready for it, if you prepared for it, it was incredible what emerged out of that. But even with this, I wanted to still persevere and see what else would happen. And out of that came one of the, I think, just most special moments of my career, right? This bird flew right over the whale's mouth just as it's coming up and feeding on the krill. And it almost looks like the whale is trying to eat the gull, but it's really just happenstance, right? That bird's just flying by, probably look down and be like, oh man, you got some bad breath here. But these kind of images come out of trying to one-up yourself. They come out of patience and they come out of perseverance. I'm going to skip ahead to one last thing here that I really want to talk about before maybe we go to a question and answer part, Evelyn. And that's the notion that I like to call the third element. Now, what is the third element? This is kind of an idea or theory that I've had for a decade now by analyzing a lot of great images from photographers I admire, right? We're bombarded with images every day, Facebook and Instagram, news media, magazines, TV. And a lot of those images you might see and be like, okay, that's a pretty image. But some of them, some special few of them, jump out to you as being like those oh wow images. And what makes them oh wow? What makes you remember that image from that photographer that you love? I spend a lot of time analyzing those images that I come across from other people that I love. I want to dissect them. I want to really think about why I love them and why they're grabbing me, in hopes that I can kind of steal some of that magic to inject in my own work, right? It's all education and it's all inspiration and just trying to kind of figure out the puzzle pieces yourself. So let's go back to this term, third element. I think a lot of those images that I love, that I analyze from other people over the years, utilize something called the third element. First element, right? In order to have a third element, you got to have a first and second element. First element, what do I consider a first element picture? Well, I think a first element picture is when we buy our cameras for the first time and we learn them a little bit. We learn some of the technical stuff that is required to be able to just operate that camera, right? Can you focus what you need focused in an image? Can you make the exposure what you're hoping for in the image, right? I don't want to say correct exposure. Correct is in the eye of the beholder. You can intentionally overexpose things or underexpose things, but can you achieve the level of brightness in a photograph that you want, right? If you have a well-exposed image and it's in focus and you have a subject, to me, that's kind of a first element photograph, right? That you have the base technical down. And that's a big win, especially when you're starting out in photography. What is a second element photograph? Well, to me, that's when you start injecting yourself into the technical aspects of your camera and the photographs that emerge from it, right? So not only can you press that button and get things well exposed, sharp, however you need it from a technical perspective, but you're also tying in composition, right? You now given some thought to how do the puzzle pieces here fit together, right? I have a foreground and I have a middle ground and I have a background, right? Or I can understand the relationship between subjects or contrast or color, right? And I think when you start doing those second element images, it's a really beautiful thing. Your images stop being as flat. They become more interesting, more dynamic. They draw you in more, right? I didn't know anything about composition at the start of my journey. I shot a lot of first element photographs. Once I started learning and reading photography books and studying images from other people and understanding some of the principles of composition, leading lines and rule of thirds and foregrounds versus backgrounds and all that kind of stuff, I started taking more second element images, more pretty images, more images that people would look at and be like, okay, wow, that's really great. And that ties me in. So if that's a second element image, when you start to tie together all that stuff, what is a third element image? Well, to me, a third element image, those images that I see from other people that are extremely compelling, it's when a photographer has pushed beyond the second element and injects a hook into the photograph. And that hook can be many different things, right? It can be just a magic moment that happens within the beautiful composition. It could be an emotional connection of some sort. It can be an environmental condition that's just so incredibly unique. It could be even something like the human element to bring a nice, pretty landscape up to more of a storytelling type vibe, right? I'm going to show you some examples here in a second. But like even think back to that image I just showed you of the whale emerging from the water and the bird right over its open mouth. I think the picture prior, 2 or 3 prior, where you just see kind of a whale tail fluking with ice in the background, that's a really beautiful moment and a nice, to me, perhaps second element image. But the fact on that whale image that I had the mouth open and the bird right above the mouth, that to me is an incredibly unique moment. It's kind of one of those one-of-a-kind moments that is a dramatic hook. So that kind of made that image up into a third element image in my perspective. So let me show you some more examples. This one right here, you take out those birds and you have a very pretty scene. Fog rising off the water, fog and mist into Fino. Really pretty, just clean and simple. It's a pretty image without those birds, but those birds give it a hook. They give it something more interesting to look at. And you're going to think all third element images require birds. I will move on to something else, but here's another quick example. This is again back in the Faroe Islands. I think I've got a nice composition here with the sweep of the cliff and the hill going down to the village, and then the contrast between the green in the foreground and the dark moody sky in the background. But I think that bird is just that added piece of interest, right? It just makes the whole image much more dynamic. This one right here, incredibly huge wave crashing in Iceland. That particular day, the waves were crashing about 75 feet tall. It's one of the biggest storms that come through the North Atlantic the day before, and now the waves are really crashing. It looks dangerous, but the person is far back and the wave wave is actually coming down 100 meters or so or further in front of him. This one right here, if I take the person out of the picture, I have no context, I have no real story, there's no sense of scale. I have an interesting shot. Obviously, it's a big crashing wave, but you miss everything without having that person there. Alternatively, you take the wave out and you just have the person standing there in landscape against clouds. I think it could be a pretty scene, but probably both images would fall under second element type categorization to me. So here, the third element is actually both those things. You need them both in conjunction to make this kind of that interesting image with a hook. This one right here, the third element is the boat going through with the fishermen returning back to port. Beautiful sunset behind, incredible, one of the best I've ever seen. Dramatic icebergs, but a very cluttered mess of ice and no real composition. But with that boat going through, that makes it interesting. This one right here, very simplistic, but I would argue that the third element in this photograph is actually the wind, right? The fact that those icicles are tilted. You can tell there must have been one incredible storm when those icicles were forming, right? So third element could be many different things, but again, it's that hook. So maybe I'll leave you before we kind of go to questions. I know it's already, we're at our time, coming up to our time already. These things go so fast, but I will leave you with a challenge to do this, to dare to be different, right? And that's not to say don't go out and photograph pretty scenes or to go to the iconic places that we all love to go to. Lake Louise, for example, in Banff. Go to them, photograph the picture that you've seen other people photograph. I think that's okay. I still do that. I still love capturing those moments and that beauty. It's incredible. There's a reason why people want to photograph that. But what I do is when I go into those scenes, I kind of get that photograph and put it in my back pocket. It's my safety shot. Makes me just happy knowing that I've got that photograph, if nothing else. But at that point is when I kind of move on to this statement, to try to dare to be different, to look for compelling, to really self-critique and go down that process of trying to one-up myself as I go along. Because that's what photography truly is, right? It's not a competition against other people. It's a competition against yourself, right? That you are trying to achieve something that makes you go, wow. Because if you go, wow, with a picture that you have photographed, it can only connect with other people. And that's kind of the bonus of the experience rather than, to me, the objective, right? Connecting with other people is always something that I'm really grateful for with certain images I share. But to be absolutely honest, when I go out there, I want to be excited myself. And I'd way sooner work through one image that makes me excited than try to get 5 images or 10 images that I'm just sort of happy with. So maybe I'll leave it at that, Evelyn, and more than welcome to answer any questions that people might have. And Daniel, if you have anything to add or to say too.
So keep those coming as we approach this Q&A. Beautiful imagery here. Now, one of the things I was curious about, you talked a lot about pushing beyond the pretty, taking in the visual inventory, and just slowing down to consider your surroundings. So what I'm wondering is, what do you do practically to achieve that when you're going out on a project or you're doing a shoot? How much time are you spending in some of these places? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Evelyn. And I mean, I think it's definitely different in every scenario, but I think some practical things for people to consider is even taking the time before you go to a location, especially if you have some idea of the location, maybe you've been there before, to really just take the time to think through what it might be like when you get there, right? Because I think that helps so much in terms of preparation, right? Like if I know that I'm going to a place, for example, with running water or crashing waves or a waterfall, that's going to completely change what I even bring for gear, right? I know that I'm going to need a tripod. I know that I'm probably going to want an ND filter of some sort. I might want a very specific lens if I can't get close access to the waterfall. For example, I might want to carry the heavier 70 to 200 millimeter lens as opposed to the wide angle, right? So I think going through that mental journey about what might be at the location is a big part of it. But I think that the key thing that I want to drive home on that is just to be very intentional when you're at the location. The visual inventory, I really do think, is one of the biggest keys to the whole thing. Again, I use the example that I used to go and beeline right to the prettiest thing in a scene, the thing that I thought was going to give me the biggest picture. And I often didn't take the time to look around at all. But the more I slow down, the more experience that I gain, the more that I see, right? And that leads to much stronger images than just being in a rush to kind of get that thing that you think might be the best thing in the scene.
Fantastic. And before I forget, we also do have Danny Lee from Sigma with us, and he's been answering a few questions in the chat too. And so, Danny, I know you wanted to say a few words on behalf of Sigma before we get into the rest of the Q&A.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Evelyn. On behalf of Sigma Canada, just want to thank Dave Brosha so much for sharing his images, his presentation. So inspirational. I have to say personally that I love sports, wildlife, and landscape photography. And after watching this presentation, it looks like I can use some of my sports wildlife lenses, like 7200s, 100, 400s, 150 to 600s, and do landscape photography. So that was kind of an eye-opener to me. Loved seeing those images. I just want to say quickly, I'll turn it back over to you guys. You can see behind me, Sigma Canada. I just wanted to mention, if you purchase from dealers in Canada, authorized dealers like the Camera Store, obviously great supporter of ours, on Sigma lenses, there is a 7-year warranty offered, and that is kind of unique to Canada. So keep that in mind, rather than say 50 or $100 and bring in something outside of Canada, you may want to support your Canadian dealers and take advantage of that 7-year warranty. Thanks again, Evelyn, and thanks again, Dave. Appreciate all your support.
Awesome.
You're welcome, Danny. And very quickly, just on something that Dan said, Evelyn, the whole notion of those longer lenses for landscape, I think a lot of people, again, think it's just a game of wide angle photography with landscape. But I will just very quickly say that now my favorite place in landscape photography is actually in that 200 to 600 millimeter range. That is, when I go out, that's usually the images that I'm looking for now. I love kind of looking for deeper scenes within the scene. So just wanted to kind of add that on.
They look fantastic.
Perfect. Well, let's get into some of these chat questions. We have lots of good ones coming in here. So first up, from Chris Andres, he was wondering about tripods. What are your thoughts on them? Do you use tripods for your landscape photography?
Yeah, I think it's one of those necessary things that if you embrace landscape photography, you have to. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I hate them, right? I'll just be totally honest that I hate tripods, because for me to go from here to down here, it involves time and changing up the legs of a tripod and kind of just adjustments. I love being fluid. I love just kind of bouncing around and seeing things and shooting quickly. But tripods to me are an incredibly necessary tool so many of the times, especially anyone that embraces long exposures or low light photography or night photography. I use Manfrotto, and I really, but I give a lot of thought to the tripod that I'm using for the type of outing that I have. I have a lighter travel tripod, but then I have a heavier, more sturdy one that I use in windier conditions and wavy conditions and everything else. And bottom line, you can't get as sharp images as you can using a tripod, or you can't go out and do, if you're all by yourself and you want to do those human element type photographs, setting your intervalometer or your timer, being able to kind of go out into a scene, a tripod becomes a very imperative tool in that process as well. So yeah, Chris, tripods, I wish I didn't need them, but definitely a big part of the equation.
Thanks. We have a question here. What are your thoughts about filters? Do you use filters in your work?
I do, and it's one of those things where there's so many different filters out there, and every photographer kind of has their go-to filters that they love. I, over time, have kind of evolved to really appreciate and utilize a lot two different filters in my body of work. Now, I know there's many more, but I find that well, first and foremost, the ND filter, neutral density filters, are the ones that I find I use the most, right? The dark piece of glass in front of your lens, or a lot of the mirrorless cameras now allow you to put them in between your lens and your camera body. And just being able to slow down time, right? It gives you such a creative tool when you're out there to be able to play with the movement of things, the movement of water, the movement of clouds, the movement even of wind through wildflowers and trees and stuff like that. So an ND filter is a huge part of my body of work. And then the other one would be a polarizer, because just the effect of being able to get polarized light, I find is really hard to mimic in post. And it just, it opens your world to a much more saturated, vibrant existence.
Fantastic. Bruce McGregor has a good question. How do you manage chaos in the field? Are there certain steps that you go through as you take pictures to manage this?
Yeah, there is. I mean, a lot of it, I think, just comes from slowing down and just really looking for those little scenes of beauty within the bigger scene, right? You walking through that chaotic, tumbled forest and looking for maybe those openings, right, where there's 2 or 3 very symmetrical looking trees. That's just one example, right? So taking the time to really look and see. But I think a huge part of that order and the chaos comes from that self-critique process too, right? When you take those initial images to analyze them, right? Is there anything in this image that is distracting, that doesn't need to be there? Can I move to an angle, or can I change my perspective, swap out my lens, anything like that, to allow me to eliminate those things that are not helping an image, that those visual distractions, right? So I think it's just really honing your eye to recognize what is a distraction. And that's where even going through critiques with other photographers that you respect can be so helpful in learning what is a distraction in photography, right? The more education you have on that, the more finely refined your eye gets. That's what I would recommend.
Jeffrey Olson says, the photos look like they have not had a lot of post-processing. Do you take the time to look at a photo that will be great right out of camera, or could you briefly walk us through a little bit of your post-processing process?
Yeah, great question. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm not a huge post-processor. I don't like spending an hour or 2 hours on an image. And some of my photography buddies joke with me that I can kind of finish post-processing a batch of pictures, an entire batch of pictures, in the time that they take to get through 1 or 2 images. I really just, I love spending the time in the field to kind of hone in on what I want, and then try to make the flip side of that as small as possible. Now, of course, every image is different. There are some images that whole post-processing stage is more involved, especially if I'm doing a blended landscape, right? Panoramic, for example, panoramic stitch, where I'm taking 5 or 6 images and putting them together, or I'm doing a blended exposure, right? Maybe I forgot my GND filter at home and I want to hold back a sky. So I'll take 1 exposure for the sky and 1 for the foreground and put them together in post. But to me, that stuff is just required time that you got to put in. The bigger part of photography is really taking the time to see effectively in the field and really honing that skill set, because once you hone that skill set, everything else should be a shorter process afterwards.
ISO Comics asks, if you were handed a low resolution 12 megapixel or 20 megapixel camera, would your clicked picture still be capable of telling a high resolution story? Yeah,
that's actually so if I understand the question correctly, right? Like, can you can you go out there and still create with a lower resolution camera in kind of a meaningful way? Well, I would say that I'm fortunate enough to shoot with the Canon R5 right now, which is an incredible camera and has megapixels galore. But most of those images in the portfolio were probably taken with Canon 5D Mark IV and prior. Because I've only had the R5 for a year. A lot of those pictures, in fact, were taken with probably the Canon 5D or 5D Mark II. So we're going quite a bit back in pixels when we get down to that stage. And if I look back upon my images that were taken with 6 megapixel cameras, even 2 megapixel cameras, there's some of those images that I still love. And I really think that, yeah, I mean, because some people do have limitations on budget. They can't afford the big 50 megapixel cameras. Don't let that hold you back, right? Because the thing about megapixels too is that most of what we see and digest and take in the world of photography is not giant billboard size, right? It's on screens, it's on social media, or prints that might be 16 by 24 and smaller. And even those older cameras that could only do 6 megapixels or 12 megapixels still fit very effectively in that space, that sizing, right? So I'm not sure I'm answering your question to your intent, but I would say by all means, I think I could still pick up a 12 megapixel camera and take a picture that I'm very proud of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good answer. Since you mentioned that you shoot with the Canon R5, we have a question from Kelly Sukin asking, have you found the Sigma lenses to work well with the Sigma adapter?
Yeah, and great question. Hi, Kelly. I know Kelly. Yes, by all means. I've been shooting with the Sigma adapter now for about a year since I got my R5, and I have my whole slate of Sigma lenses, and I haven't encountered any problems at all. And it has, yeah, it's been seamless. I just have nothing bad to say at all, and that's not just because Danny's on the call right now.
Yeah, so just a couple of the email questions. Since you've spent so much time in nature, looking for this visual inventory, have you had any close encounters with wildlife?
Yeah, good question. Ironically, I have had a very serious encounter with wildlife, but it was in my pre-photography days. In the very first year or two that I was kind of just discovered photography and still shooting with a 2 megapixel camera, a Fujifilm camera back in 2002. I was a telephone technician of all things, one of the guys that climbed the telephone poles and fixed staticky noise on the line and stuff like that. And one very kind of scary day, I came face to face with 3 polar bears that were right under me as I was up on the pole. So it wasn't spending time doing my visual inventory, but that was probably the most dramatic and terrible wildlife encounter I had in my life. Since then, I've been very fortunate when I go out and do my visual inventory. I think the worst wildlife that I have to fend off is mosquitoes. So I hope to keep it like that.
That's not so bad. In your career, I mean, you photograph such a wide range of subject matter. Do you ever struggle with the fact that you are a multi-genre photographer? Like, do people say, like, well, what kind of photographer are you? And what's your answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, that's been the story of my last 20 years, because I discovered many years ago that I did love everything, and I did love wedding photography and portrait photography and wildlife photography and landscape photography. And it was really problematic when you try to come up with a business card because you can't fit 20 genres on a business card. It used to actually bother me, right? Like, it used to bother me that I can't really call myself a landscape photographer. I can't really call myself a portrait photographer. And then, I don't know, I had a shift about 10 years ago where I'm just like, you know what? And I looked around to some of the great photographers out there, like Joe McNally, right? Joe McNally is one of the world's best portrait photographers, but he's one of the best sports photographers. He's one of the best photojournalistic style photographers, and he worked for National Geographic for many years, and he calls himself a proud generalist. I'm like, that's actually great. Well, like, why am I ashamed to call myself a generalist? I want to be good at everything. I find it all fascinating. And my challenge to myself, my goal to myself, is to be as good as I can in every genre. And personally, I would find just picking one genre kind of boring, right? Just for the way my brain works. So I would say if you're one of those people that like landscape photography and like portrait photography and like wildlife photography, embrace that. The key thing is, are you having fun? Because I mean, that's the bottom line of photography, is that you are enjoying it and you are having fun. And it doesn't really matter what other people think.
Now, just to wrap things up, we have a couple more questions from the chat. Back to the post-processing. Do you shoot your images in Jpegs since you don't believe in doing a lot of post-processing? Or do you still shoot RAW?
Yeah, no, I still definitely shoot RAW. And I don't want to give the impression that I don't post-process. I just don't spend a ton of time on each image. But having a RAW file is still imperative to me. And it just gives you so much more latitude on that end with post-processing. Sometimes I will quickly mention, though, I do shoot in JPEG plus RAW, especially when I'm shooting in monochromatic mode, right? Like monochrome mode, when I'm shooting in black and white, because when you shoot in black and white with a RAW file, like in camera, you're out there, you turn it into black and white, you shoot it, the RAW file that comes back to you is in color. And sometimes I like seeing that reference of what exactly I saw in the field. So by getting that JPEG back, it gives me that great starting point for my black and white post-processing.
Brad McMillan made a comment. Hi, Brad. Just saying that our lens requirements become much higher with being a generalist. So this actually ties into my Sigma question, and that is, what is your kind of ride or die Sigma lens? What is your favorite focal length to, I guess, travel with or to do landscape, since that's mostly what we were looking at today?
Great question. And I definitely struggle with that too, because I do have favorites on both sides. I have favorites for landscape. I have favorites for portraiture. I have favorite for wildlife. I would say just very quickly that my favorite landscape lens, and this might be surprising, is kind of that 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Or if I'm not hiking in the field, I'm lucky enough to have a Sigma 500 millimeter lens, which I love. But practically most of the time I'm carrying around a 70 to 200, the 14 to 24 millimeter lens for the wide angle stuff. And I really love the 40 millimeter prime lens from Sigma as well. So most of my environmental portraiture work these days is shot with that, but it's also a great kind of landscape lens out there in the field as well. It's a great street photography lens. So that gives me, if I just had to pick 3 lenses to put in my bag, that gives me an incredible range and covers, to me, the portrait world, the landscape world, and even wildlife world if you have the 70 to 200. And you're fortunate enough to have your wildlife come a little bit closer to you.
Thank you. Okay, last question before I just get into my little wrap-up notes. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about what they can expect to find inside your book? We just brought in a bunch of inventory of Northern Light. I put the link in the chat, and so you can check that out. And they're 20% off for the 25th anniversary. So yeah, Dave, what can you tell us about it?
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having the book there, Evelyn. So the book that you have there is called Northern Light, and it's basically 10 to 15 years of photography through some of the world's most beautiful northern lands. I've spent time in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Northern Labrador, so all the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, but also Greenland and Iceland as well. And so it's a combination of landscape, some wildlife, and even some portraiture. I was able to sneak in a few portraits into that book as well. And so, yeah, that's that. And I should just mention too, and I don't even know if you know this, Evelyn, but just by chance in another week or two, my next book, Southern Light, comes out, and it's all having to do with Antarctica, South Georgia, and the Falkland Islands. So the land of penguins and whales and all the landscapes down there. So that's in stores in another week or two.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely have to get on that and make sure we bring it into the camera store. We have such a wide range of books from so many of our friends and people that we know throughout the world. So it's wonderful to have you as part of our collection. And thank you so much, Dave, for joining us today for this special TCS TV Live as part of the 25th anniversary. It means a lot to have you join us. And of course, for Sigma Canada sponsoring.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I was going to let Danny maybe speak first, and then I'll say something at the end.
Awesome.
No, thank you, Evelyn, and congratulations to the Camera Store on their 25th anniversary. And I just wanted to mention, in regards to Sigma, we've got some back-to-school specials running till the end of September, some of the best prices of the year. And on top of that, for joining this presentation, I know the Camera Store has put together a special promotion that they'll be sending out to you. And thanks again, Dave. Inspirational as always. Loved it.
Thank you so much, Danny. And the final thing that I'll say is just, well, thank you to Sigma, but wanted to just say for the Camera Store too, there's a lot of like retail outlets across Canada that sell camera gear, but I just really appreciate your business's support, true support of the Canadian photographic community. It's really inspiring, and just when I was a young photographer starting out, people would rave about you guys, and I grew to learn why. You've been just fantastic to so many people that I know, and to so many photographers, and just a wealth of knowledge. And just wanted to thank you guys so much for hosting me today and all these wonderful talks that you're putting on.
Thanks so much, Dave. And just a reminder to everyone that we do have Paul Zizka tonight at 7 o'clock for another presentation. He's good friends with Dave Brosha, of course, with us as well, and so we're looking forward to that. But this was just such a wonderful, wonderful talk with Dave. And like I said, check out his book. You can check out all the Sigma deals at thecamerastore.com. And if you registered, we'll email you some additional special offers. If not, send me an email to evelyn@thecamerastore.com. I'll make sure you get on that list. Otherwise, please subscribe, hit that notification bell, and we'll catch you again very soon.